Ladies and gents, welcome to a video about perhaps the most prevalent thought process modality leak in all of poker. You probably commit this leak multiple times per 5 minutes every time you play a poker session. I've probably seen this leak in every single coaching session I have ever done, and this leak even ensnared me today and caused me to make a massive punt in the last hand that we are going to look at. Before we get into the action though, here's a quick story for you. I was sat by the pool on my honeymoon in Lanzarote a couple of weeks ago, and I was basking in the sunshine. My pale Scottish complexion was gradually being turned a less peely-wally shade of white, and I had the following thought. Let's do a promotion at Carrot Corner this July. We are giving away subscriptions with the purchase of our premium courses. Pick up cash injection and get a free month's membership to our Carrot Corner subscriber library, full of content from loads of cool coaches that we've taken on recently. Pick up grade 1 of the Carrot Poker School and get yourself 3 months free subscription. Pick up the full Carrot Poker School, that's the full scholarship, grades 1, 2, 3 and E, and get yourself 6 months subscription free only for July. Head over to Carrot Corner and check it out. In the meantime, let's fix a leak that will hopefully net you a bunch of money. So this is a hell of a claim, right? The most common leak in poker. It feels like it could be clickbait. It feels like some of you may already be skeptical watching this thinking, no way is this going to be the most common leak. But hear me out. The leak we're going to look at in this video is a modal leak. It's to do with a mode of thinking. And therefore it can apply to almost any spot at all. Like imagine you had a personality disorder where you were really obnoxious, rude and violent every time you saw another human. You can imagine that that would be a huge problem in almost any situation. That would be your biggest leak because it would apply to all areas of your life and it would hold you back in every capacity, right? Whereas if you had a more, I don't know, situational leak, like you were really terrified of birds. Okay, that would be a bit annoying if you went to like a nature reserve or if you were like by the sea where there's loads of seagulls in Scotland, the country where I live. But you could probably avoid birds enough to get by. You could just stay indoors. You could go to places where there aren't any birds. You could wear some kind of visor so that you couldn't see the birds. I don't know, it wouldn't hold you back as much. If you were afraid of donuts, that wouldn't really hold you back at all. You could live your life in a very normal way and just don't go near donuts, right? So basically the point I'm making with this metaphor is that the more widespread the leak is, you know, the larger the domain over which it can get you, the more of a problem it is. And the leak we're going to talk about today can apply in any hand. And that leak is, editor, drum roll please. Being too vague. Yeah, being really vague is killer. Using vague maxims like, my hand feels like a mediocre hand here, or this is usually a spot that we do B60, or like, I saw Solver once say something like this, or in a YouTube video, this guy once said this. It's so vague, right? And it can cause you to fail to hand read. And hand reading is what you have to do if you want to get to the true EV behind your options and you want to pick the best option. So in this first hand, we have the Queen 9 of Hearts on the button. Thank you for entertaining my initial rant here. I do think it's important that we lay the groundwork for this video. And I'll show you how we could have been too vague here. So right away, pre-flop here, we have a close decision between folding, 3-betting, calling is probably not horrible either. Most people don't play cold calls here. We decide to 3-bet, which I think is like kind of break even and okay. If your opponent is weaker, if you're in a softer pool, you want to play this hand every single time. So like if a recreational player opens in a game where you think you have an edge, you just always want to 3-bet a hand like Queen 9 suited in these positions. We go for the B60 on the flop here, which is a reasonable way of playing Jack 5-4, big nut advantage spot. Pretty big range advantage spot as well. 5s, 4s aren't really in the opponent's range all the time here. And yeah, we just have a massive overpair and top pair monopoly here. A lot of Jack X is going to be 4-betting pre. We go check on the turn here. We decide not to barrel here. We have pretty much the nut worst kind of barreling candidate here. We are blocking folds like King Queen of Hearts, Ace Queen of Hearts, Ace 9 of Hearts. We only have 1 over to a hand like Pocket 10s. It feels like we should just be betting with our King Queens, with some of our Ace Queen, Ace 10, like bigger overcards, stuff with 1 diamond. Stuff like 6-7, etc. There's just loads of hands here we want to bluff. I think this one is getting pretty close to a pure check back. So we decide not to barrel this time with this hand. Villain then on the Queen of Spades River where we kind of hit the dream card. Goes ahead and does something that is going to be fairly face up. Bets 1/6 pot. This could be a slow play sometimes. It's possible. But for the most part, in a pool like this, 100 Russian cash GG, this is going to be, well, a capped range. It's going to be a lot of Jack X. It might even be some naughty merges that shouldn't be getting in there, like pocket eights and stuff like that. But for the most part, our opponent is going to have a Jack on this node. Therefore, our hand is going to come in at something like 82% equity. That would be my guess against this range in real life. And with 82% equity, you can go ahead and make a pretty big, hefty range. Big, hefty raise. So when you're hand reading your opponent here, it's very important that you pay attention to this bet and you zone in on this bet and ask yourself what it means. The big leak I see in my students' game here is that they just call here or they raise really, really small because they have some vague impression that their hand is weak. Their thought process goes something like, well, Queen 9 is not that strong a hand because King Queen would be better and Ace Queen would be better. And they kind of very vaguely and generally slot the hand in their range somewhere, but they don't hand read the opponent enough. They don't commit to really asking themselves, what is the honest evaluation of the opponent's range here and what am I going to do about that? Once you ask yourself that question, what does the population commonly have in this spot? How is their range weighted? You're always going to find a big hefty raise here because you're going to realize that you are near top of range, meaning you have a hand that is a massive, massive equity favorite against your opponent. And when you have hands like this, I heard Cruiser, our coach, talk about this in a recent video, you go for max value, right? You go as big as you think the equity of your hand can support. And I could have gone even bigger here, honestly. I could have gone to like 45 or something. I could have gone up to about that. It might even be better to. Probably people aren't that elastic with a jack here. They're either going to call you or not based on what they think of you, based on the mood that they're in. They're very unlikely to sort of discern between a raise of 31 and a raise of 40. So I like that I raised like fairly big here, but I should have probably gone a bit bigger still. There is some Queen X in the opponent's range here. There is some Ace Queen. There is some King Queen. I do expect these hands to usually bet larger than this though, so that they're at a low frequency. But the generalization error that you can really fall prey to here would just be to go, man, my hand is okay, my kicker's not that good, I can see some hands I'm losing to. Generally, hands that aren't that good don't raise the river. And then you fall into the generalization pitfall. Be honest with yourself, guys. How many of you fail to raise this spot or raise really tiny in this spot because you're just obsessed with the idea that your hand isn't that strong and you've just taken a really big, broad, thick paintbrush to the spot without going into enough detail and without saying what is actually the rough percentage chance that I'm beat here against this line? And if that's very, very low, then I should be playing the equity of my hand and raising bigger as we're taught to do right back at the start of the Carrot Poker School in grade 1, lecture 2 on value betting. Let's go to the next hand. All right, here's another spot where being too general, being too caged in, boxed into like very habitual, vague thinking is going to be a disaster. And this honestly happens like 9 times an hour when I coach poker. I do hour-long coaching sessions, and this comes up in like, I don't know, 60% of hands where there are mistakes or something like that. And the reason I know this is that when I do coaching, I'm always very deliberate. Always make sure that I'm saying to the student, what was your thought process here? Like, justify this to me. What are you thinking now? What were you thinking then? Give me a really honest analysis. And very often they'll say something like, well, in game, I just had the thought, blah, blah, blah. And I'll say, well, what do you think about that in-game thought? And they'll say, I don't like it. And I'll say, why? And they're like, well, it doesn't really get to the point. It's just like kind of a lazy thought that doesn't really apply to the true situation in front of me. And that's how we know we've found one of these specificity generalization errors. So here we are on the button. We have gone ahead and raised pre. We've got 2 callers. Both look to be recreational players, I'm guessing. This guy leads third pot here. This is going to be very mergy. It's going to be draws. It's going to be gut shots, flush draws, ace X, jack X. We want to raise very big here. Say this is a mandatory raise, and we should probably just make this like 14.5 or something. I commit a specificity error here because I say something like, oh, well, generally speaking in 3-way pots, your sizing should be smaller. So I'm not going to raise as big as I perhaps want to instinctively. I'm also a little bit rusty because I've been basking in the sun and eating lots of octopus for the past 2 weeks, but that's not a mistake. It's very bad to eat octopus, by the way, guys. They're incredibly intelligent creatures, and I'm not proud of the fact that I eat octopus. Do as I say, not as I do, both in poker and in eating sea creatures. The King of Diamonds comes on the river. We should probably have gone bigger on the turn, but the specificity error got us here. But on the river, if we start, being lazy, if we start falling prey to our desires and whims and short-sighted hedonic motivations, then we will maybe say something like, oh, I really want to get called. Like, wouldn't it be nice if I got called? Like, I'm just going to bet a sizing that an ace will call. Like, an ace isn't calling a very big bet here on average unless villain is a massive station. So realistically here, what you're going to be making a ton of money from is a flush, is a worse boat, is something like a jack. And therefore, when you're against a recreational player, you have the uber nuts, you have top of range, you have the immortals, you should put all of your money in the middle. And you shouldn't feel bad about this. And if you do feel bad about this, guess what? You don't deserve to play the fucking game. Get out of here. Stop watching. Oh, you're writing an angry comment? That's fine. You can write that, then leave. Cool. So the reason that you lose a lot of EV here by betting 22 big blinds and thinking like, oh, I block the board, or, oh, villain's not going to call me with worse, is that sometimes you're just wrong. And villain has a flush. And the Jack X of diamonds is even possible here. And they call off 90 big blinds or 85 big blinds, right? So if you imagine that this all-in bet gets called a third of the time, and maybe that's optimistic, but you'd be netting an extra profit, something like 28, 29 big blinds, something like that. If you bet 2/3 pot and you're called 100% of the time, which you won't be, you don't net that much, right? That's a very crude kind of automatic proof that this is true. The amount of elasticity, the amount of hands that would have to be folding to this bet but not folding to pot here in order for pot to be better than this is absolutely enormous. And it's just not the case when your recreational opponent has landed on the river with many combos of flushes and trips, which they have, right? They undeniably do have some of these hands. So yes, when villain has ace-5 of spades here and has made a bit of a loose call on the turn for the spot, they're going to fold to your all-in, and maybe they won't fold to 2/3 pot, but they very often will. But trying to get blood from a stone, begging and praying and pathetically snivelling along the ground like a slug, looking up at your opponent, being like, please call me with some shitty hand because I can't handle not getting the dopamine hit of getting paid off here, that's killing your game. I'll be totally frank, that's destroying your win rate. So if you don't like it, if it sounds really crude, good, I'm trying to shock you here. I'm trying to jolt you out of what could be a bad habit of betting 22 big blinds here. Okay, the guy folded. This time we didn't get paid. This time he didn't have a flush, right, with the quick fold here. But it's not the point. Top of range wants to play for stacks. It wants to play for loads of money. And the way to do that is to put all the money in the middle and not fall prey to what we call this mode 2 thinking. In Carrot Corner, we have 3 ways of thinking. Mode 1 is instinctive. It's good. It involves hand reading. It involves like doing mental battle with your opponent and relying on your instincts that hopefully are, are built from some level of experience by now. If you're watching this channel, they probably are. That's good. We like mode 1 thinking. Mode 3 thinking we also like, which is kind of analytical. It's problem solving. It's explicit logic. You can't do too much of that in game, so you have to be careful. You want to mainly hone that out of game, then come back to in game and use it a bit. But the type of thinking we want to really stay clear of at Carrot Corner is mode 2 thinking, which is governed by desires, whims, overgeneralizations, lazy pattern recognition, not actually engaging properly with EV. Sometimes it's just born out of like what you want to happen. You want to get called. You want to get the payout here, right? So that's why these mistakes get made. When you're coaching poker, it's not really sufficient to say, this is a leak, avoid it. You actually want to tap into why humans make that kind of mistake. Now we're going to talk about a fold with the 9-5 offsuit here. This is a very clear fold. You should definitely make this fold. Okay, good job. On to the next hand. The decision of what to do with ace-jack off here. Here's how I think about it. It's close at equilibrium. If I'm a bit shorter here and I think my opponent's jamming a lot, I'll probably just call. If I'm against a really strong player and I'm not feeling like I'm playing that well, I again might just call and not 3-bet mostly. Otherwise, I'll mix and not really care. But when I'm against a weaker player, I will usually 3-bet for the reason that pre-flop, they're very likely to under 4-bet. They're likely to call too wide. They're likely to call too many dominated hands. Basically, your big sort of bruiser style offsuit, hit them with a big blunt object hands like ace-jack off. They're going to go up in value when you're against a recreational player because they're just going to be called by so many more weaker combos that should fold, such as queen jack off, or maybe something like the jack 8 suited or the ace 8 offsuit from time to time, ace 9 off. The more your opponent's calling hands like this, the more you want to go ahead and actually 3-bet these combos. But go for like a b40 on the flop, which is undeniably okay at this SPR. I don't really care too much about that. There's a lot of things we can do. We decide to check the turn here. Probably going to play a check raise, check jam against most bets here this time. Villain does check back though, and we head on over to the deuce of clubs river. So this is definitely a hand that is winning sometimes on this node, because our opponent could have something like ace 4 or ace 5 or king queen of spades or something like that. And our opponent might not know that they have to bluff the river in these kind of action sequences with those combos, right? They might not understand that after we bet the flop and then check the turn and then check the river, that they can't show down king high because they have more fold equity on this line than they would need to break even, right? That's kind of the theory of the spot. That's the nuts and bolts. So I do think checking overperforms here in reality. I think it performs better. The problem is that I think that would be lazy, right? So again, if we want to sort of predict the overgeneralization thought process that would go wrong here, it would be something to the effect of, I still have a bit of showdown value, therefore check, right? That's one very vague, lazy, general way of thinking about the spot. The problem with that, of course, is that when you commit that thought process, you're not actually comparing the EV of checking to the EV of another candidate line, right? You're just saying, oh, I'm just going to do it because I've identified one factor that sometimes explains why you should check. That's really, really lazy. That's like saying, I am going to go and pour myself a glass of water from the tap because I'm thirsty. Okay, well, that seems fair, but what if the situation is actually that you are in the middle of a job interview in a room that has a sink and a tap, and you just stand up in the middle of the question and just pour yourself a glass of water? You open a cupboard, you take a glass out of the cupboard in this interview room that you've never been in before. It's the first time you've met the people in charge of this company who are hiring you for the job, and you just help yourself to a glass of water without saying anything, right? That's kind of weird. You probably shouldn't do that. You should be contextually aware. So just because being thirsty is very often a sufficient reason to go pour a glass of water, like it would be in your own home or in your mum's house or something like that, that doesn't mean that you're going to do it in that job interview. Just as here, having showdown value is very often a sufficient reason to check back the river. For example, if this was blind versus blind single raised pot and I see bet the flop and they called and then it went check on the turn, I would definitely check the river here. It's a no-brainer. But this is the 3-bet pot. This hand has less showdown value. Villain's taking a pretty capped action sequence here. We have a very key blocker card in the Ace of Diamonds, less so after this action sequence. Like, honestly, I could care less because people just don't slow play. I flush that often on the turn, but it helps a little bit. Definitely helps. Could also be a good blocker effect that, like, Villain is going to be more inclined to call a jam here with a hand like Ace 10 offsuit with the Ace of Diamonds and without, or something like that. Or could be like Hero calling the river with Ace Queen offsuit with Ace of Diamonds but not without. Something like that could also be the case here. But in general, what you have to do is say, in this specific scenario, is the showdown value of our hand that much? And if not, is that a sufficient reason for checking? Meaning, is there really no better line than checking, right? Because to say that checking is right is to say that there is no better line than checking. To do X in poker, you have to be able to defend the position that Y is not better than X. It needs to not be a Y that's higher EV than X in order for X to be right. But people forget this, okay? People forget this all the time. So the reason I don't think checking is right here, even though we have a very vague general reason for it in the form of showdown value, is that I think this line is better. I think the jam is better. When we jam here for nearly 3x pot, we're going to need showdown value in the vicinity of about 73, 74%, something like that, to make the nearly 3x pot the best play. For 2x pot, right? To remember, it's 66%. For 1.5x pot, it's 60%. So it's good to learn these milestones. And yeah, I just think that Villain will have a really hard time calling here. I think this will get through 80% of the time, plus something like that. Not all the time. Like, I definitely think 20%, 21% of the time, something like that. Just guessing here, we're going to get called. But I think after this action sequence on this pool, there is a line that is better than checking and significantly better than checking. Now, we should point out that if we were only literally getting the 70% or whatever we'd need to break even here, the 72%, just guessing, we would actually want to check because we established that check is plus EV. But the idea is that I think if we're getting around 80% fold equity here, then jamming is much higher EV than checking because the showdown value is so minimal. So the point is, don't let lazy generalized thinking stop you fully exploring the spot. On that note, let's move on to a hand that I truly butchered, in my opinion, where I didn't hand read. I actually fell prey to this error. I was getting a bit tired towards the end of the session, and I was four-tabling, and I got distracted, and I just fell right into the pits of despair here. I just did the very thing that I've been preaching against in this whole video. You're never immune to this, guys. It doesn't matter how experienced you are, how long you've been on the streets of poker. You're never immune from the overgeneralizing pitfall, and I'll show you how it got me a little bit earlier today. I'm actually a bit embarrassed about this hand, which is sending me a clear message that talking about it is exactly the thing that I need to do. Whenever I feel ashamed of something, like I want to sweep it under the carpet, like I want to uninstall the app from my phone because I played a bad game of chess or whatever it may be, that's when I really need to catch myself and I need to say, no, you're doing that trashing the board metaphorical thing that you used to do as a kid. Like I was a very, very bad loser as a child, and sometimes I would actually like be playing a game of chess against my dad or be playing a game of snakes and ladders when I was like 3, and I would hit like a big snake and I would just go fuck this, and I would just like toss the board. And my dad, you know, all credit to him, he was a really good dad, but in some sense he was really too soft with me when it came to games. He didn't want to deal with my outbursts, and he would sometimes just go, okay, well, yeah, you've ruined that, let's just move on now, and, you know, we'll play again tomorrow. And it was never really a sufficient reprimand for me trashing the snakes and ladders board. And that's definitely made poker harder for me, right? That's made like a lot of competitive stuff I've done in my life harder because I've been less willing to accept adversity and defeat. When you fuck up, when it's your fault and you do something wrong, unlike just like landing on a terrible snake that takes you all the way back to the beginning of the board, when it's actually your fault, when you voluntarily stepped onto that snake, that's the very moment where you need to look yourself in the mirror and say, okay, I fucked up. Like, how did that happen? Why did I do that? You shouldn't beat the living hell out of yourself, but you should ask yourself, what steps am I going to take to make sure that I don't commit similar mistakes in future if I'm really serious about this endeavor of trying to get good at cards, right? So in this hand, we go for an ISO here. We could go bigger. Again, one theme that I've noticed is that I'm a little caged into small sizings for no reason. When I'm like raising pre, when I'm doing stuff, I'm just not really like oiled up enough yet. I'm not really, like the cogs are kind of like a bit rusty and they're just grinding a bit noisily in my head. They're not really smooth enough. And I just need to sort of loosen up and be more subtle and be more creative. So we see bet the flop here. We go for a check on this turn, which is like a little bit weird. I was just kind of going for the check raise here against the idea that people are just reopening like far too wide on this node. I think people are generally just going to be betting the turn here with a queen too often, betting a random underpair for no reason in this pool, especially like a limper. I think going for check raise here against a small bet makes some sense. If I face a big bet, I'm just going to check call probably, because that's going to be much more polarized to stuff that beats me and stuff that's bluffing. So this sizing is kind of in between, but I think it's large enough that check call probably plays a bit better here. There's a bit of King X in villain's range here, but not very much. The thing is here that when you're really hand reading this spot properly, like when you're actually not being lazy and you're actually properly hand reading, you can see that the opponent does have some 4-3s, some 4s, some 3s, some king queen. There's no absence of those combos. There could even be some king 4 suited, king 3 suited. They've called a relatively large bet on the flop, so they've had some reason to want to continue here. They don't have absolutely nothing. The 6 gets there on the river, which kind of stops them having that many bluffs as well, but that's not really the point. So already on the turn, I've checked the turn and I've check called the turn with the idea that if I check jam, it's getting kind of thin because villain just doesn't have a lot of natural King X combos that they would normally have because they've filtered on the flop, right? So their bet call range or bet stack off range on the turn is probably one that aces is not doing very well against. But on the river, I forgot how we'd got here. I forgot that we were deep. I forgot the action sequence. And this is a really horrible play I'm about to make here. And villain bet kind of small. But the thing is that recreational players don't think in terms of the pot. So this isn't actually that small to some recreational players. It is a bit capping, but it's not absolutely capping, right? So the question is here, if we were to jam, if we were to raise all in, and all in looks like the only raise size that's really viable, okay, maybe that's not true, but let's just say it is for a moment. What's actually bet calling here that we beat? Like there are maybe some combos of like the king jack of clubs that are sometimes getting curious, but a lot of people are going to fold one pair here to a jam, right? They're not just going to bet call off that hand. It looks like the main bet call range here if we jam is something like 5-7, 4s, 3s, king 4, king 3, king queen. King 3 is probably raising, king queen is probably raising pre quite often, so I'm going to discount it a bit. But this is not a raise, this is just a call. We are beating some value, right? The opponent can have queen X, it's just merging inexplicably. They can have king jack, they can have king 10, they can have stuff like that. However, they do not have much of a bet call range that we beat here. But when you're four tabling and you don't have much time, you can overgeneralize and you can forget everything. You can just go small bet capping, hand good, now jam. And that's exactly what I did in game. And as soon as I made this jam, I was like, hold on a minute. We got to this particular river with an action sequence that made me not want to raise the turn. And this is a fish, so this doesn't have to be all that capping on the river. I think raising here, jamming here is just way too thin. I had more time as well. I rushed this. I had another 10 seconds, but I'm like multi-tabling. I really kind of hate this play. I think we're a big dog when we get it in here. I think it's horrible. But, you know, this is my F game. And sometimes you're capable of just blundering horrendously because you just think in completely the wrong layer of specificity. Now, in life, it's easy not to do that, right? Because we've literally evolved to be social creatures, and we know that when we are in that interview for that really good job that we want, that we shouldn't just go into the fridge and help ourselves to a sandwich in that interview room. We know we shouldn't do that. But in poker, we can't tell our own kitchen from the interview room, and we make these mistakes by being in completely the wrong mode. So when I say it's the most common leak in poker, what I really mean is that this is a leak that can happen to you in almost any situation, and therefore it could apply for your entire session. I do see this hand on a daily basis. I do see this leak on a daily basis with my students, and it's debilitating. You're not going to cure this overnight. I would just urge you guys to become more aware of it, to ask yourself, am I overgeneralizing, to try and spot it a few times in your session when you do this, so that you may form the habit of interrupting it and stopping it in its tracks before it keeps you down at low stakes, before it ruins your win rate and kills your potential and causes you to make punts like you saw in that last hand there that I played. If you like the content, head over to Carrot Corner, take advantage of our July mega sale, get some free subscription with the next course that you pick up, and I will see you back here on YouTube for another video very soon. Like this video, let me know. Didn't like it, let me know. Angry because I told you you don't deserve to play the game, too bad. Let me know though. And I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.